I don't understand why Bo. Bo. How could Bo be the name of a Torah portion? Torah portion, Bereshit, that's a Torah portion. Vayetze, Shalach, Yitro. I mean, those are Torah. Bo, come on, that can't be the name of a Torah portion. Maybe we should just skip this week entirely. I don't know. Let's just, Jeremy, shut it down. Just shut the whole thing down. Rabbi Saroken, you. Okay, we'll do it. I don't know how they snuck it in, but they snuck it in. Well, the truth of the matter is the Torah portions are named from one of the first words that comes up in generally the first verse of the Parsha, and here Bo el Paro. So go into Pharaoh. Go into Pharaoh. This is God instructing Moses again.
You good?
Get
all worked up about that.
Just needed to get that off my chest. So 27 years ago, this Shabbos, 27 years ago, I gave my senior sermon at JTS on
so funny.
Parashat Bo, Parsha. So it's amazing the time has gone by. We were upstairs and we were talking about 27 years ago what salaries were, what cars cost. We were talking with Randy. Really funny.
What did you talk about for your senior sermon?
I talked about I talked about what was Pharaoh's resistance to letting the people go, and I argued that his resistance was not in letting the men go out and worship. He was fine with that. What he didn't want was to let the children go. Right?
Yeah.
Because in the children, that's the symbol of continuity. That's the symbol of the covenant moving forward, the tradition moving forward. And Pharaoh's goal was to stop all of that. Yeah. So it's when Moses says, no, both the old and the young, children too. Then Pharaoh says no. So I talked about that.
I love that. And actually, it's an interesting thing too, because he says like the old and the young, the men and the women, right? There's sort of this like, it's everyone that needs to go.
And the cattle. And the
yeah. It's funny. Before we did this, Rabbi Schwartz was sort of teasing me that, as I said last week, I don't really like these plague Torah portions. But I said this one is actually much better for me than last week's because there's 3 plagues, not 7. And I think there's also this really interesting thing going on, right? So there's this idea of, I think, as you were sort of noting, like, what does it mean to say we won't leave anyone behind in our community, right? That like everyone matters, the old and the young, the men and the women, even like the animals, right? Like there's this sense of like, I don't know, like we're not only responsible for each other, but like we take care of each other. I feel like that's such a powerful message. And then there's also this crazy thing that goes on with the hardening of the heart. And we see it in these last 3, three plagues. And finally, Pharaoh says, go. And then
slaying of the firstborn.
Yeah. After that. And I think the slaying of the firstborn is actually also interesting because what you see in the slaying of the firstborn or the killing of the firstborn is that like that impacts everyone, right? There's not a house in Egypt that doesn't have
Ein Bayit She'ein Sham Mei.
Yeah. Right. For like the person who's, the prisoner in the jail cell, that firstborn and Pharaoh's firstborn, like that is a huge impact. And I think it's interesting to me that there's so many things that feel really important just in the world that we're living in to sort of reconnect with this story.
Yeah. No, I think that's, certainly if you think about Israelis, and, it was very palpable when we were in Israel, it's over a year ago at this point, and every Israeli is directly impacted.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's definitely some resonance with that. One of the curious things about the Parsha is it kind of switches back and forth. You have some of the narrative stuff, Pharaoh and Moses and Aaron and the plagues and the people ultimately leaving and the Egyptians giving them gifts, which is a whole weird thing in and of itself. But then you also have interspersed in it some of this sort of Passover stuff.
Yes.
And also the calendar is presented, and it's just this sort of weaving of these different ideas and different kind of concerns. I mean, you see it in the Torah where narrative gets interrupted for genealogy
Yeah.
or whatever. There's a classic, it's a very curious Rashi comment, and it's at the beginning of Genesis, actually. Jeremy behind the glass was talking to me about this earlier. Rashi, we were talking about, not really, but we were, and Rashi says at the beginning of the Torah, so it's the first verse of Genesis, Rashi says, why start the Torah here?
Yeah.
And Rashi says we should start the Torah in Exodus chapter 12, which is in Bo, and that's the calendar. That's the calendar. And I guess Rashi's point is that it's the calendar that creates a unified sense of peoplehood, because you're sharing time, you're sharing narrative through the calendar, right? Jewish narrative and all those kinds of things. Just sort of an interesting comment there.
Let's jump in at the beginning with this sort of scene. So first we have the plague of locusts that are going to sort of come around and cover every bit of the land, and also make sure that there's not one piece of sort of green left, which is a really sort of powerful plague. After that, you have the plague of darkness. And the darkness, they said, was like a different kind of darkness. It wasn't just lights went out in Egypt.
Right. It
was a darkness that was really thick, so much so that people not only couldn't see each other's faces, but couldn't move in
palpable.
The darkness.
It was
yeah. It was sort of
viscous almost.
Yeah. And the Torah also tells us that with that plague, there was darkness for all of the Egyptians and all of the Egyptian homes. But in Goshen, in the place where the Israelites lived, there was light, and they were sort of moving around, with ease there. And then that's the plague where basically, they're sort of asking to go and worship the Israelites are asking to go and to worship their God. And they're asking for everyone to go with them. And that's when Pharaoh sort of says, get out of here, get away. And if you come back to me, if I see your face again, you're going to die.
Right.
And Moshe was like, all right, I get it. We won't be seeing each other again. And then God goes back to Moses, and God says, I'm going to bring one more plague upon Pharaoh in Egypt so that he's going to finally let you go and drive you out of here once and for all. And then he says, tell your people to borrow, right? That's the borrowing of the silver and the gold, which it says the Egyptians sort of happily hand over. And then God announces this final plague, which is going to be the death of the firstborn.
Right.
After which Pharaoh finally says, just go. So I'm just wondering, when we look at these final three plagues, at this point, I don't know, what do you think this experience is like for Moses, who's sort of beating his head against the wall at this point, right? He keeps going back and in some ways he knows he's not going to win, right? He knows that Pharaoh's gonna, seems obstinate and sort of unwilling to negotiate. What are your thoughts about Moses's experience in this?
I always feel bad for Moses. We talked about the poor guy. He really, I just really think he has it rough. But he is sort of has this astonishing stick-to-itiveness.
Yeah.
He's like, all right, I'll go again. I'll go back. And in the end, it's that kind of perseverance that maybe enables the whole thing to flow from there. I mean, obviously, the way the narrative is told, this is what God wants to happen, so it's going to happen.
Yeah.
But remember, Moses is fighting two battles, really, because he's dealing with Pharaoh over here, and then over here he's dealing with the people. And the people are like, we don't want to go necessarily. We're not, and that's where that whole kind of Passover piece pops in. Like, this is what happened that night, and the blood on the lintel and all that stuff that's in Bo. But Moses I think he's just got such a tough task, but he does it, to his credit. I mean, he does it. He could say, you know what, I'm out of here. I'm done. Because he said at the beginning, hey, I don't want to do it. It's that classic, we've all been in that situation. You're like, I don't want to do this. And then you end up doing it because for whatever reason you feel you should. And then like you get in trouble for it. And you're like, geez, I didn't want to do it in the first place. And now look, and that's kind of, it's kind of Moses. How about you? What do you?
It's so interesting. Gideon is putting together his summer jobs. He's 20 now, which is crazy. And we were going back and forth. Like he has this one job offer, and it's a great job, and it will be a spectacular fit for him. And they offered like a salary, and that was just sort of like their initial offer. And so I said, why don't you go back to them and just ask if they could do a little better? Like nothing, it can't hurt. Which I knew suggesting is awkward.
Right.
Right? Like that's awkward. But I feel like, it's not a terrible thing to learn to do or to do things that are hard. And I feel like Moses did something that was hard, and he got, he didn't get the result that he was looking for. And then God kept making him do it again and again and again. And I feel like there's like maybe something to be said for I don't know, building resilience or building grit or building a ability to hear no and not to get sort of shut down.
Yeah.
Like I mean, I think about all of the big things in the world that are sort of worthy of our time, care, or attention or energy, and a lot of them take a lot of no's.
Yeah.
And it requires a lot of work, and things don't happen easily most of the time.
Yeah. No, I think Moses, definitely shows that in the course of his life. And again, it's, you would think like, okay, once you're out of Egypt, then
the
hard,
party
like the
began.
hard work is done. Right. Exactly. But the truth is it's hard from the whole time.
Yeah.
The whole time. I mean, he really is, he's sort of a kind of master at crisis management.
That's
it's like one crisis after another, and he figures it out. He kind of swoops in and has to like patch up the things and fix this and take care of that and put out this fire. But he manages to do it. And
So that's an interesting thing too, though, because in some ways he does manage to do it, and he is a great crisis manager. And in other ways, like he has consultants and he has like people that are helping him, right? Like he has his father-in-law,
yeah,
who sometimes makes an appearance and says like, this thing that you're doing isn't good. Do it this way.
Yeah.
And he's like, okay, or he actually says like, okay, can you come with me? Like, can you do this with me? And his father-in-law says like, nope, but you can do it. Right. And then you have Aaron, who's by his side. And Aaron, I think in some ways, even though your like sympathy oftentimes goes to Moses, like, what do you think about Aaron's role?
Well, I was thinking like Moses' help is Aaron, who initiates the golden calf episode. Oy, like for help like that, I can, no, but I think it's an interesting actually thing to think about where Aaron's the older brother, and Moses does seem to rely on him. Like I think he looks up to Aaron as an older brother, and although I would say the heavier burden falls on Moses, I think he does feel that he's supported by Aaron, and even like that's God's response. When in Exodus 3, when Moses is saying, "I don't want to do this," God says, "Aaron will help you do it," and here Aaron's a source of support as well. So I think there is something to that. Yeah, I do. We all need support, right?
And I love that Aaron messes up, right? The part you just sort of referenced. Aaron eventually, builds a golden calf, because Moses leaves and he's like left alone. And he's like, here, just give me your jewels.
Well, he was in a tight pinch too.
He's in a pinch.
Yeah.
I know, he's in a pinch. But then afterwards, one of my favorite things about the Torah is that, one might have thought that Aaron would be significantly punished for creating the golden calf. And the punishment was meted out, right? Like there were people that were punished. But Aaron would go on to receive this like honor of taking care of, like he would be the Kohen Gadol. Like he would be responsible for all ritual, for the people.
Right.
Which I think is such an interesting thing, just talking about second chances, that here was this person who made the biggest mistake a person could do, or made the, when it came to ritual.
Right.
And then he was sort of trusted to be responsible for the ritual life of the community.
Yeah. Well, maybe God had a sense that back to that idea that Moses had a need to have that support, and so God was sort of like, and the truth is that's a whole complicated situation in Kitisa. We'll talk about it in a few weeks, where the golden calf episode is described. There's a lot of things going on there.
Yeah.
But back in Bo, so we do really get it really, there are sections in the Parsha where it's very like hardcore Passover.
Yeah.
Like there are verses taken for the 4 sons
Yep.
from this Parsha, the whole, like the ritual, the symbolism of the matzah, the Paschal lamb, Pasach to Passover, like all that stuff is here in the Parsha.
Yeah, that's chapter 12, verse 24. But you also see even before that those Passover ideas, right? Yeah, a lamb for your family, slaughter the Passover offering,
all
take
there.
a hyssop and dip it in blood, and apply the blood to your doorposts. And no one should go outside the door of the house until morning, for when God goes through to smite the Egyptians, God will see the blood on your doorposts, and God will pass over the door and not let the destroyer smite your home. Observe this, right? Like all of these things.
Right. What's the Hebrew for destroyer? Is it Satan or? So like from shochet.
Yeah, to like slaughter.
Okay. Yeah.
The slaughterer.
Slaughterer. Yeah. I can't help but hear, the words of that chapter and think of the 10 Commandments movie.
I've
seriously.
Never seen it.
Really?
No.
I mean, Jeremy, have you seen it? Really? So that, there are sections of it that are obviously like, total Hollywood, but they do parts of it and they lift it like right out of the Torah text. And a lot of that chapter, like they show the putting blood on the lintel, and the angel of death is symbolized like moving over. It's just sort of, it's interesting like that. And of course the blood on the lintel becomes a mezuzah later, right? It's also amazing. You think about it. So text of the Torah, let's say that it's 2,500, 2,600 years old, something like that. As it's coming together in its various parts. And here we are, 2,600 years later, we have a Passover Seder. These symbols still resonate in our community and in our lives. It's really, to me, it's such a striking thing.
Just the continuation of tradition and Torah.
Yeah.
I think when you get to that place, one of the verses that's like always sort of like shouts out to me and has me lingering over it a little bit is the verse 30.
In chapter 12 there?
Yeah. Vayakam paro Lailahu v'chol avadav v'chol mitzrayim. I actually think the Vayakam paro is actually fascinating, right? That it's the middle of the night. God is striking down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from Pharaoh's firstborn to the captive's firstborn in the dungeon, and all the firstborn, even of the cattle. And then I think it's Vayakam Paro, and Pharaoh wakes up.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just this like unbelievable thing that like your entire people and your land is being like hit with plague after plague after plague after plague. And I feel like, who can sleep?
Right.
Except Pharaoh does. Like, all of a sudden, this scream sort of wakes him up.
Yeah. But maybe it's, maybe it's not, maybe it is like an actual waking up out of sleep, but also sort of waking up out of a moral turpitude, sort of fog of confusion about, how to deal with the situation, all the evil that's been done in Egypt and all that kind of stuff. I'll show you a very cool thing about this. I'm doing this from memory, so I hope I'm right. Otherwise, Jeremy can just cut the end off. So this is the 12th chapter?
Yeah.
Well, how many verses is the 12th chapter? It's long. It's like, is it 51 verses?
Yeah.
51 verses. That means the middle verse should be verse 26, right? If it's 51 verses, you have 25 verses before 25.
Okay.
Look at verse 26. Again, I'm doing this from memory, so.
Yeah.
No problem.
V'haya ki yomru aleichem b'nechem ma ha'avodah hazot lachem.
Yeah. So that's
Yeah.
so that
When your
that
children ask you, what do you mean by this rite? You
what
shall say, is
yeah
the Passover
yeah yeah.
sacrifice
I
to
think
God.
it's very cool that at
Uh-huh.
the center of this parsha, at the center of the chapter,
Is
and
when
it's
your
all
ch-
about Passover. There's a verse, and it says, "Your children will come to say to you, what does it mean? What does this all mean?" And you have to, and when that happens, you have to have a good answer, a compelling answer.
We had Dr. Erica Brown this past week for Wit, Wine, and Wisdom. And one of the things that she does a really beautiful job talking about is sort of like, what are we passing down to our children?
Yeah.
And some of that might be sort of a ritual object, an heirloom, if you will, a Jewish heirloom. And it was actually very funny, but she was saying that to people, and she said something like, think about like, what did you receive from your ancestor, like a Jewish heirloom? And she's like, and what are you going to pass on? And she
Right.
said, don't be cheap about it because no one wants to keep your crap. And
Right.
I was like, oh, that's so true. You got to go get a nice Kiddush cup. You've got to get a nice like challah board, right? Like you've got to sort of like offer these.
Don't give away your comic books, But yeah. Yeah. Well, I have it. I could give it to my kids. I could buy a house one day.
Really?
Depends on the comics, but
Huh.
yeah, essentially.
Interesting.
10 cents back in the day.
Funny.
15 cents. I remember 15 cents. I don't remember buying for
They're
10
that
cents.
valuable.
But you're right. So that's that sense of how do you transmit?
Yeah, and by the way, like, I think for so many people, having a Jewish family, for the next generations is so important.
Yeah, for sure.
And then the question is, for all of those people for whom that's really important, how are you bringing Jewish life, into your family's life? How are you telling the story in such a way that your kids really know why being Jewish matters?
Exactly.
You know?
Maha avodah hazot lachem. Like, what does this all mean to you? So the challenging thing is it feels like it's harder and harder to do that today, right? The comforting thing maybe is that we know it was a challenge then. That's that whole thing that we were
Right.
talking about. Like, no, the children have to go.
Yep.
If the children don't go, the whole thing's not
Yeah.
worth it. So it was challenging then, it's challenging today, but it's comforting to know that they figured it out then.
Yeah.
And so there's hope that we'll figure it out today
Yeah.
and pass it down.
And maybe that's actually really where I don't know, I feel like maybe it's the homework of parents to really think about this question. Like, what does it mean to you?
Right.
Like, we've got to have a lot of clarity around that, and both in our ability to tell that answer, but also, I think, in our ability to show that answer.
Yeah.
Right? Like, where are we creating space in our lives for Judaism to live, not because it's threatened, but because it's beautiful?
Yeah. Exactly. Well, we're getting the wrap-up sign from Jeremy. Jeremy, many thanks as always. Many thanks. Folks, thanks for joining. See you next week.